It is such a beautiful and spiritually elevating excitement when I teach a student the piano, one to one, even online in those viral days for safety of both. But the essence is captivating, especially when you know that most of the pianists who started playing, let's say, when they are 5 or 6 as children, most of them, when they reach 20 years later the level to be in a doctoral program or start thinking about what they play more than just learning how to play it, have started usually with Bach onwards in repertoire until the 20th and 21st century repertoire for those who adventure there. But teaching a seminar on Baroque music for the doctoral students, I find to be also a very fascinating responsibility to share this enthusiasm for this time period, which in fact they ignore because it starts with Bach going backwards into at least a century or two in order to cover the so-called Baroque era, which is so many things within one era, in countries, in instruments, in capacity of tuning, in expression of arias from opera, which was born recently then, or the church music with the cantatas, the fugue, which was a pure music for keyboard, playable organ, of course, mostly harpsichord also. But the composers, their filiation, their influence, Frescobaldi teaching, and then a student learning from him like Froberger, who was German, going through the French court of Louis and becoming aware of the French clavecinists and cross-pollinating like a bee through Europe with the different experiences of the different genres or styles or fashions, which naturally in the 17th and let less early late 16th century traveling was scarce, expensive and dangerous, not to mention impossible sometimes. So the echoes of the different stylistic factors of Italian music or Italianate style, opera, to start with the name itself, work in Italian, or the French Baroque opera, which Lully, Italian composer, the court of Louis XIV, the king's son, basically put together the theater plays with the ballet, comédie ballet, and created a French art form of opera, which was naturally sung in French, versus the Italian, which comes originally more from the Commedia dell'arte characters, and it was in a way not a national art, but it was exploring different ways of being expressive and reaching audiences through these very undemocratic societies, the helm of which you had these despots who reigned over empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the English, and the French with all their colonies, and the Dutch, and in fact, music was functional. Well, always is, but more practically so, and more necessarily so because of no captive music. You cannot record it and keep it and play it when you need. So there is a capacity of the music of the past to reinvent itself in terms of rhetoric, gesture, in terms of expression of the soul of the humanity and the culture of the people. And what kind of legends you put together to incorporate in an opera in order to create a sense of following not only the opera itself, but the arias of it, which become as hit tunes, their exact today's pop music narrative. And so from there you have composers writing variations on those pop tunes, like Green Sleeves, Flow My Tears, Rogero, and more. And the written text was lesser important than the decorative, ornamented, and basically, I would say, customized text. A bit like jazz musicians today, with the chordal progressions of the grid and then the improvisation of everything in the melodic and decorative variations aspect of a hit tune. Take the A Train by Coltrane and all that. And so you find that a lot of different solutions are able to be understood, for for how much they traveled and corresponded with each other. This remains the chance of the happy few, like Handel, who was the Prince of Hanover's composer in residence in northern Germany, who by a game of successions became King of England. On the way to England to take the throne, he brought with him his court, of whom Handel, who attended a beautiful motet performance by Lully's composing for the return to good health of the King Louis XIV, the 14th. And attending this Te Deum performance, he used the melodic line and harmonic progression, but with English words, and created the English anthem for his new King of England on Lully's sounds and texts. Borrowing, stealing, today we have different opinions about these kind of things, but in that time it was homage. It was probably that it was. And in fact, when Bach dies in 1750, his latest son, composer, dies. Didn't die. He was only 15-year-old at the death of his father, and his oldest brothers, who were famous composers like CPE and Johann Christian, was only 15, so probably were 15 years older than him, and Friedemann, the firstborn, too, and were out of the house. But Bach left his family in poverty after his death, and Handel took under his tutelage Johann Christian, last composer, son of Bach, and managed to get him a position to teach harpsichord to the children of the Queen of England. What a good position for him to compose sonatas. And he even met Mozart as a child prodigy in turn, who visited him and who took the first three of his sonatas, opus 6, and made them into piano concerti, one child to the next. And I find that beautiful. Not always the case, because sometimes you have naturally hard to get jobs that are very in demand, and that makes us feel a bit humble about our hopes for our jobs and our professional activities and development. Handel, of course, succeeded internationally, becoming the greatest English composer, being German, but also international, obviously. But the fact that somebody like Bach was relatively little traveled and knowledgeable of the worldliness of things, but he still tried to keep up with the fashion, with English suites, French suites, Italian suites. How much they were really that, or ethnomusicologically not as much as today, with knowledge of access to all these elements rather than hearsay, and some format and some genre style. When Bach wanted a better job than Leipzig in terms of pay for his large family, he attempted the position in Dresden, which was a Catholic church, better pay. He wrote the B minor Mass, even if he recycled this Cantata 12 into the Mass in order to get it on time for the deadline. He composed most of it new, but it became Crucifixus in E minor instead of the opening of the Protestant Mass, the Lutheran Cantata 12, Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Sagen. This incredible lament, chromatic descent of the bass, and suspended suspensions of each voice entering in one after the other, representing the pain of Christ. I mean, this is just sound painting. There is no tomorrow today, ever, except you didn't get the job. with that mass. So if you can fail a job with a B minor mass, it makes you feel better when you fail a job yourself. Or of course it doesn't. It feels bad anyway, anytime, for all of us. But it's a fact that I find relatively interesting also about the personalities and how, of course, ambitions and desires and positions were scarce. And of course, in these autocratic situations like the Louis XIV, the King of France, who was reigning on his subjects day and night for everything, from what they dance to what they eat, and they had to watch him do all of that daily. He was in representation. And the violinists of Louis were the Violon du Roi, that was who were led by Lully as a sort of a swarm of birds walking around him when he was walking in the court or in the park, with his own music playing according to his steps, dotted rhythms, the ouverture à la française, the French overture style. And Chambonnière, Jacques Champion, who was a great harpsichordist, falsely accused of not knowing how to do basso continuo, probably another of these court politics. And he had a student whom probably he liked the most, was Louis Couperin, the uncle of the famous François, who died in his 30s and started writing this amazing, so-called today unmeasured preludes for the notation that is leaving a lot of room for improvisation. And then Danglebert, who was his other student. And Jacques-Henri Danglebert got the job that Louis forbid himself to accept, because the fact that it was the job of his teacher, who in his eyes was unfairly treated, to be pushed out of the job for perhaps not knowing, which I doubt it was the case. Probably was another reason, but they flaunted that he cannot write or play rather a continuo bass. I hardly doubt that. But the humanity behind all this is so relevant today. You know, everybody is a voucher or a today's, every time we have auditions for a position, we have finalists, and we have to hope to get the job, and so many others deserve, and you think you deserve it, and at some point you hope to get it, and sometimes you're hopeless. And I have doctoral students who finish after 10 years and finally get a position of teaching, the rest being accompaniments. So you have to have a lot of tenacity, believe in yourself, and be there. Of course, it doesn't always work out. Not everybody is made to be a warrior, especially when you're in art forms. But nevertheless, I find that very touching to see that Louis Couperin refused the job because he thought it was unfair that his teacher was asked to give it up. But his other student, Danglebert, took it. Does it mean Danglebert was nasty and Louis was nice? No, of course not. But I find that also an important factor of understanding how the humanity of it all works. Of course, I like to teach the students how students in the Baroque time studied music. They copied the music from the teacher's score in order to learn how to write. In fact, the composition student was really the one who learned how to write by copying the master scores. How they connect the thoughts, how they organize the bridge, how they organize the form, how they know to modulate in a way that is subtle or beautiful or meaningful, and what effect. And then they perform them, of course. And so I give the students to learn how to write their own fugue, how to play their own fugue, voice by voice, sing it, write it from Bach on their own multi-layered staffing with clefs or not, well, depends of who is familiar with them, but to think the piece not as reduced in the notation for piano with stems up and down as all editions reduce it for the pianist to read. And at the same time, I also give them a chance to develop decorative or redecorate a Bach andante from a partita. Not to make something spectacularly surprising or daring, but just to see how the decoration was in fact not essential, but of course beautiful, but according to some composers was in the hands of the performer. But the real notes, the blue notes, are the ones that are the ones of the punctuation, of course. And so you have to take that in account. And I also asked them to bake their own Bach prelude, which is a catchy title, to take the skeleton of the Bach first prelude of the well-tempered clavier chordally, and then dress it up in another piece, either existing, either of their own pattern of imagination, to dislocate, into a way differentiate rather, the structure from the dressing, which is what the music of the Baroque was usually, from the bass line to the top. Emanation of the bass line is the melody, not the melody being accompanied, as Romantic era will bring it later with Chopin's arias on piano, bel canto, nocturnes, imitation of this incredible, beautiful operatic history of music, or the bel canto that came later. But in Baroque days, they did have to complete or perhaps change or add a trio to a minuet, which I also asked them to write. You have to learn how to do because you study how they did in the past. But that doesn't mean that you have to be only locked to how they did it. You could also input your own creativity. After all, when we find pieces they wrote, sometimes we find that they didn't follow their own rules. And that's beautiful, meaningful. You learn how to avoid things in order to not avoid them when you think they're meaningful. In other words, the purpose of the dispensed study through realizing what you're not allowed to do is to push you to do more interesting things in terms of voice leadings. And once you get it, you can be provocative. And, for instance, Bach in his Chorales Is Genug uses what sounds parallel chords, which was totally forbidden, let less on whole step, provocative ending and beginning, both of his chorale for 4 voices, SATB. And then, of course, with a clever voice leading crossing of the alto and the tenor over each other, you obtain this effect of parallelism when in fact it is contrary motions. So you have to learn how to enjoy the subtleties of their writings and immerse yourself as a student today if you were a student then. Like Bach taught inventions not to be played like he wrote them, but to invent your own ones in real-time contrapoint, like keyboard harmony for the continuo, real-time contrapoint by combining 2 voices in a contradictory motion, or perhaps in a continuous motion of the 2 in the same direction. Of course, today's teaching is based on recitation of performance because the interpreter is not the composer, who's not the musicologist, who is not the scholar, who is not the music historian, who is not the person who writes the articles about in a CD or in a magazine, or the reviewer of your recordings, or a teacher who teaches music theory. In other words, we have, in a way, a teaching that is overly professionalized and very little homogenized to encompass all, the holistic learning. And I give them a glimpse of that with these hand-on exercises with transcription of organ prelude, choral preludes from like Orgelbüchlein by Bach, like O Mensch, Beweint ein Sinn de Groß in E-flat major, with the most incredible chromatic ending that moves you to the highest spiritual uplifting, regardless of one's predestination for that or not. The music itself is so powerful and so suggestive and so intimate and so intense. It doesn't scream, it just holds inside and brings you so much. And so you can play it on the piano with a clever way of reorganizing the octaves of the pedaling of the organ with the dual manual or triple manual of the organ, voicing and colorizing like in an orchestration the chorale that Bach played for the entrance of the congregation in an improvised or notated afterwards, or perhaps both. I don't know any, I wasn't there, of course. But it's so beautiful to imagine him bringing them, the congregation, to bathe the sound, immerse themselves in the chorale of Luther of the day, which will be sang SATB at the end of the cantata for the day for which he composed the piece. so they can transcribe it on the piano and translate the organ on the piano. Understand the harpsichord not just as an instrument, but as a rhetoric, as an expression, as an uneven expression, as delaying tactics for the articulation that bring a certain expression that through the tuning, mean or whole tone, or perhaps, I mean, not full tone, but the so-called well-tempered tuning for the unisons, allowing you to be in every key rather than singing in keys or playing rather in keys where doesn't sound right to the tuning. But it's all expressive ways to bring the human emotion, manipulate the psyche of the listener, just like a theater play would have done with the words at the time. Combine that in an opera, in the cantata, with the story of Jesus every week. I mean, through the keyboard, harpsichord or clavichord or lute, Lautenwerk, lute keyboard, as Bach had one made for him. Regardless of the instrument, through the instrument they express, for instance, left hand expresses a lot of eighth notes, but they were bowed like for the what we used to be on the gamba or the cello, the bass line or the continuo of the harpsichord harmonized, and then you had perhaps a violin, an oboe, or a singer doing contrapuntal layers on top. You can play it all by yourself, you can put it in en concert, as Rameau used to say for ses pièces de clavecin, where you could add a flutist and another instrument, violinist. And so your continuo in the left hand of eighth notes is not continuous like in the andante of the second partita in C minor. It has to be bowed by groupments of notes and not always predictable by 4, by 2, by 3. Of course, you don't have a bow, so you have to imagine it, but you cannot just play all detached or all legato just because you play it on the piano. It's not an excuse and it's not a reason. It should be a calling. And you have to listen to how people played and how people heard the piece and how people imagined the piece. And even if you don't play it on the authentic instruments, you can play it with the authentic, or at least what we know today to be the authentic gesture of the music making. That's fascinating and enriching, bringing these pianists to know so much more about an era they didn't study, becoming pianists from Bach onwards in the repertoire. Here is Bach before, and you have Caspar Fischer and Weckmann and Cabanilles, and of course the English virginalists and Dowland and of course the French clavecinists, Dandrieux, and so many. Such richness. And such a chance to have the time and the capacity to reach the scores today and learn them. The probably composers of the past would have dreamed to, had the opportunity to. Perhaps they could have written less, having known more of the music of their own past. But we know so much more. And the more we know, the more we discover, the more it's marvelous. And hopefully it also brings juices to our own creativity. After all, creativity is the key word, isn't it? Rethink, refeel, rewrite, reimprovise, restate,